Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us so much this afternoon. We're excited to talk about social listening with you all for the next hour, strategy that's becoming more and more critical with digital's continued rise. Just a note for everyone, we will be reserving some time at the end of our presentation for some Q&A, but feel free to put questions in the chat along the way anytime, and we may even answer a few of them as we go along. We'll continue to monitor it, but we definitely will save some time at the end. Just by way of introductions, next slide. I'm Erin Demore. I'm Vice President of our digital marketing team at Reingold. For those of you that are less familiar with Reingold, we're an integrated marketing and communications firm supporting lots of work with the federal government, some state government work, nonprofits and associations, and commercial entities with a variety of communications challenges and opportunities. And we spent a lot of time in particular with veterans, connecting them to various services and benefits, and also in the healthcare space, again, with nonprofits, associations, and commercial entities. And just this past year, we were the lead digital agency for the 2020 census. A great opportunity for us on one of their largest communications campaigns, one of the largest in the government every 10 years. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we did for them later here today. We've also done a good bit of work helping organizations navigate COVID this year, and some of the challenges and opportunities from a marketing standpoint, and we'll also dive into those. But for now, I will let Chris introduce himself.
Hey, I'm Chris Lewitsky. I'm a senior associate working with Erin on the digital marketing team at Reingold, and I'm kind of the lead social listening person at the agency. I've worked on the implementation of social listening for a variety of our clients. Spent a lot of time with that on the 2020 census, but also some of our smaller clients, nonprofit and association work that we'll get into today. So I've been really lucky to be able to see this tactic and industry grow over the last several years, and love bringing it to different clients, different teams, and really excited to talk to you all about it today.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So diving into the next slide, some of these shouldn't be any surprise, but we really wanted to host this webinar on social listening because we feel it's becoming increasingly more important in today's digital age for marketers to understand and to know how to use social listening and the opportunities that exist. And just a few stats here on the slide that I think really help illustrate that point. First, social media usage continues to grow. I think sometimes we sort of get asked whether we see it plateauing, and the fact is no. I think day by day, quarter over quarter, the reports show that social media usage is still on the rise. 70% of the population is active and at an average of 82 minutes per day. And many people are on more than one channel or network now, right? They're spanning many different networks and engaging on them quite a bit each day. So still very pervasive. Social media is also playing a larger influence in consumer decisions. And I think this is really important. 54% of social media users use social to research products and services. 71% are more likely to purchase products and services. So there's a lot of influential conversations happening on social media, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of how you find the relevant ones, break those down, and sort of get meaning out of them. But it's important to be in the space because as users are interacting with each other, with their own networks, with brands, with organizations, they're making decisions around who they want to interact with, who they want to buy from, which service they want to connect with. So a lot of good content there that's really an opportunity to find and interact with. But the third bullet, it's becoming increasingly tougher to sort of break through the clutter, right? Because there's more people using social media and they're spending more time on it, and therefore there's more content, there's more conversations happening really every second. And so finding ones that are relevant to you can be challenging, and we'll talk through how to help navigate that. But 96% of social media posts don't mention a specific brand. So that means context is king, really trying to find the communities where your audiences exist, understanding sort of the different topics, keywords, and types of conversations that are happening related to you if they're not specifically mentioning your brand or organization. Really, really important to leveraging social media and social listening specifically. And then this last stat we thought was pretty pertinent, especially right now, given the times, and that's half of marketers worldwide are now using social listening. One of the biggest trends we've seen over the last 9 to 12 months, really, since COVID increased in the United States is an increase on social media usage. A lot of people are spending more time, wherever they are at home, and therefore they're spending more time on social. And from a marketing standpoint, a lot of organizations are having to make shifts too in the way in which they engage with audiences and where. So social listening has become increasingly more important from a marketing standpoint, given COVID. And I think we see that really continuing, obviously, throughout the remainder of the year. So we're going to dive into a quick poll before we get started. Would love for you all to fill it out, and we'll take a minute here. But really, how familiar are you with social listening?
So I'm really excited to see these poll results. I have no idea what it's going to be. Sometimes I overestimate how much people know about social listening, working in it day in, day out. So we'll give this a minute to populate, and then talk about it. And if you're not familiar, that's what's coming up next. So no worries about that.
All right, so it looks like we've got pretty even distribution, mostly clustered in the little familiar to somewhat familiar. That's great. Chris is going to talk through sort of a quick primer on what social listening is and how to think about it. And then we're going to spend the majority of time really diving into a few, what we see as sort of high opportunity use cases for social listening with some case studies from our work here at Reingold.
Yeah, so for those of you who are not familiar with social listening, no worries. By the end of today, I think our goal is to get you to somewhat familiar, very familiar. You can always be more familiar. Years ago, if you'd asked me what social listening is, I would have said I had no idea. But I think it makes sense once you learn about it. And what it is at its core is using the publicly accessible social media posts that are out there to understand what people are saying about a topic, a brand, an issue, whatever you care about. There's thousands, potentially millions of posts that people are posting publicly about that topic. So using tools to analyze and bring them together so that you can understand what's the overall conversation, and doing that through search queries. So almost like, think about it a little bit like if you could Google search all of social media and get all the results back, what does that look like? Of course, this is public data. We're not looking in Facebook Messenger, Instagram DMs, things like that. But what we do get is we get a lot of really good data from Twitter, from Facebook pages, Instagram posts, but also things that you might not think about when you think of social media, like Reddit, like forums and blogs. But that's where, for a lot of topics, that's where you can get really good content that I think brings a lot of value to the table when you bring all the different platforms together. And using those search queries, you can get as narrow and specific as you want. You can also go very broad depending on what your goals are. And when we talk through the case studies, we're gonna talk through a bunch of different examples that some were very broad, some were very specific. But the commonality across the benefits of social listening regardless are, we want to identify trends about who is influencing the conversation, what is the conversation, where is it emerging, what platforms is it happening on. There's a lot of different variables you can look at, but depending on the organization, each of those can tie to different business goals, and really makes you smarter, better marketers and communications professionals. And the way we think about it is, if you're not looking at this data that's out there waiting to be used, you're just leaving it on the table. It's a cost of doing business and being in social. So that's why we're looking to do it as much as possible in different ways for different brands. So next slide, please. As we get into the case studies, you'll see these are kind of the 3 different ways we broke them out into what are these goals of countering direct competitors, defending against brand risks, anticipating industry shifts. Aaron, as you know, and as we've talked about so many times, there's so many different ways social listening can be used for organizations. So I don't want anyone to think these are the only 3 use cases, but these are 3 we really wanted to focus on for today's webinar.
Yep, thanks, Chris. And hopefully some of the case studies will show sort of the variety even under these use cases with which, social listening can be applied. So let's dive into the first one, countering direct competitors. So probably some of you have very specific competitors or a set of competitors maybe, and others of you maybe at organizations or associations that might not have a direct competitor per se, but similar or comparable organizations or entities that are still overlapping with your mission, right? Or trying to get your audience to connect with services that some other organizations also are offering. And whether you're trying to drive sales, increase membership, or get customers to use your resources and tools, whatever you have to offer, it's really important to understand what these competitors or comparators are doing and how they might be impacting your organization's success. So Chris, why don't you dive into this first use case study here a little bit, just to give a little bit of background. We do a lot of work in the healthcare association space, as I mentioned, particularly around member engagement, patient outreach, and advocacy. And one of our clients of several years is a physician association that's been consistently fighting a scope of practice battle for several years with a competing association. And at the end of the day, their mission is to ensure that their members are able to provide the highest quality of care to their patients. And that was in jeopardy a bit with this proposed policy. We often see social media as sort of a critical grassroots channel in driving advocacy efforts, using targeted messaging and outreach to sway public and getting them to take an action, whether it's signing a petition or sending an email to a congressperson. So it was really critical that on behalf of our client, we were able to understand what messaging and outreach was happening around this policy change, so that we could help inform our client on how to battle this. And Chris, walk through this a little bit, sort of the challenge and what our solution was.
Yeah, so before we implemented a kind of a social listening plan, our client was pretty reactive in terms of the competitor putting something out and then it being a little bit of a fire drill. I'm sure we've all been there. Is someone, you or someone on your team, brings something up and it's, oh, what do we need? We need to do something about this ASAP, which understand sometimes that happens, but really we wanted everyone to be a little bit smarter and look a little bit longer term for how to put together a strategy to defend against that. So there were 2 solutions we implemented. One was identifying the overarching narratives and shifts in those narratives of the direct attacks in competitors' messaging. And you can see the chart on the right would show how we do that a little bit, but grouping their messages that they're putting out on public social media and saying, well, how many of those messages fall into theme 1 versus theme 2 versus theme 3, and saying, well, we can really see that they're focusing on message topic 1, and that's where we need to be counteracting. That's where we need to be pushing up against. If, for example, we were putting all our efforts on messaging topic 4, well, that's only 10% of what they're focusing on. So really making sure efforts line up with those shifts in narratives and what's happening over the course. of weeks and months. And then the second solution, which these go hand in hand, as I'm sure you can imagine, was tracking more specific granular outreach, considering this was a policy push. Outreach to key elected officials, government organizations, key influencers was one of the tactics that all organizations in this scenario use. And being able to get more intelligence and data around who they were engaging with, who they were reaching out to, or putting out that they had reached out to or made these connections with certain elected officials, had the support from certain elected officials, allowed our client to better focus their outreach efforts in certain geographical areas, because this was a state by state issue. So if there were certain states that were being focused on by the competitor, not reacting too late to that and having that better intelligence were kind of the two solutions that right away went hand in hand. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see kind of the outcomes of these solutions, which were identifying potentially illegal activity from a competing organization that ended up being taken down. But really overall, the outcome was counteracting those advocacy efforts, and by being able to better focus our messaging and then creating a paid media campaign to push back against that more directly. So being smarter and smarter with those paid media dollars and reaching the right people on the right messages at the right time. And that has allowed, or it has prevented those industry changing regulations from being implemented. And Aaron, we both work with a wide variety of clients, and I don't think this is something that is just applicable to these really specific legislative pushes. I think we're seeing a lot with an administration change and just the world being in a state of flux, that a lot of organizations and industries are tracking something similar of there could potentially be a big change on the horizon.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Chris. I think anytime there's an administration change, there's a lot of legislative and advocacy initiatives sort of on the agenda. And I think that's a great point. It's really important, even if certain ones weren't on your radar, that there might be, certain issues tied to policy that are starting to rise, that it's important to really keep a pulse on so that you're able to take a more proactive approach and less of a reactive. And I think that was critical here, Chris, too, wasn't it? Was sort of getting ahead, so it wasn't to the point where the competitor had gained too much traction. We were able to be a little bit more proactive in helping them frame their strategy.
Yeah, exactly. Again, forecasting where your competitor or comparator organizations are going is huge, so that you're not behind the eight ball so much. That's something we see this kind of overall tactic or perspective used a lot in the private sector with social listening, because there are those kind of more direct competitor organizations where you're working within a space where you want to keep eyes on 2, 3, 4 competitors. But as we've alluded to a lot, there are, I think with any industry, there are organizations, companies, brands that, knowing where they're going with their campaigns, with their messaging, can be really valuable to making sure, again, you're not behind the eight ball.
Yep. And I think when you think of competitors, comparators, obviously this was specifically focused on a pulse policy, and we see a lot of applicability there within, definitely, I think, within association, within government, nonprofit, even commercial. But I think also just understanding what your competitors are doing on an ongoing basis. It could be new campaigns they're running that are taking your share of consumers or audiences away, or launch of sort of, their new products. So I think, as Chris said, there's a lot of ways in which this can be used, certainly for pulse periods, but also on a consistent sort of always on or evergreen basis. Great. So if we head to the next slide, we'll dive into use case number 2, defending against brand risks. I think this is probably the most common use of social listening, I would say. People wanting to directly know when their organization, association, agency is being mentioned. And we agree this is critically important. But I think it's also important to understand that your brand is more than just your name online. You know, it's potentially your tagline, your CEO, board members or employees, your campaigns or initiatives, and sometimes even your key messaging phrases. And so the challenge of understanding your brand gets a bit more complex than simply, you know, creating a Google alert or a keyword alert every time your association name gets mentioned. It's really looking holistically at all the sort of attributes of your brand and understanding how it's being mentioned and when there are trying to stay ahead of, you know, risks that might occur. So we've got a few case studies here that we're going to dive into, which sort of bring this to life. The first one, so the Census brand is one of the biggest brands in the federal government agency. We had the pleasure of working with them to support the 2020 census over the last few years. And there's no more critical time for census than every 10 years when they're trying to rally the entire country to be counted in the decennial census that informs where billions of dollars go into communities. And so you add on an election year in 2020, an unplanned pandemic, and we knew that Census's brand was going to be all over the internet. In some places, very positively, people encouraging others to take the census. In others, negatively, people bashing the census or saying this is not important, or trying to make sure certain groups weren't counted. And in others, sort of outright threats. But sort of our mission was critical to support census, get as many households as possible to respond to the census, and therefore we really needed a comprehensive multi-pronged approach to brand monitoring to ensure this. So Chris will talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we identified some risks and how we helped to combat those.
Yeah, actually, if we could stay on that previous slide for a minute. One of the things that we saw we were really focused on when people taking the census was making sure that everyone was able to take it when they could. Looks like we're going ahead. If we could go back to the slide with John Legend, I don't want to miss the drama of John Legend tweeting out an issue about taking not being able to take the census, which was something that we saw right during that peak of those operations. There was a technical glitch where a small number of people were not able to complete when they were using the online self-response form. But even when you're talking about millions of people, even a small percentage of people is key. So I love John Legend. I was not a fan of him this day, putting census on blast in this way, but I also did appreciate it because you want, when you're in communications or not in communications, if there's an issue with the website, a form, a donation piece, you want to know about that as soon as possible. And so we set up alerts and we're able to escalate this issue to the web team as it was happening in real time, as people were experiencing it. And if we can go to the next slide now, please. This is, as I'm sure you can imagine, was a web technical issue. But what social listening was able to do was, in addition to identifying that people were experiencing it and posting it on social media, we were able to confirm when an effective fix had been fully implemented, when those complaints had stopped, and we're able to do that on a really granular basis, looking pretty much multiple times a day of when that fix had taken place. And so people were able to complete the census as easily as possible. And the scale of this issue is, of course, as Aaron said, much bigger than pretty much any other communication campaign we will ever work on. But what you can take away, and what I've taken away, is that this can be applied to pretty much any organization who has a public facing website. Those donation forms, like I said, if you're hosting an event and registration goes down, things like that, really that issue alerting as quickly as possible. And the screenshot here shows how simple and effective that can be at times. This is kind of a screenshot of the back end of what we do to set up those alerts. They can get extremely sophisticated. We had over 350 different types of alerts for the 2020 census campaign because of all those brand threats. But as simple as setting up a few for different organizations so that you're not in a situation where something happened and you're finding out about it hours or days after the fact, which I think is everyone's worst nightmare. If we move to the next slide, please, I think we can talk about a few of our maybe not favorite examples. I don't know if I would call these my favorites, but these were other brand threats that the census faced. Over the course of a year, we dealt with people putting on boycott campaigns on Facebook, false information of data being leaked, a lot of reports of census workers coming to people's doors without masks, just a lot of information and potential threats to the campaign that we identified by keeping tabs on all this different type of social media, and we're able to escalate to various teams to work to remediate that, or working with people in the field to make sure, hey, remind all census workers to wear their masks and make sure that it's happening. So Aaron, I know you were working on census a lot in the social media space, and weren't as in the weeds on social listening, and I was, but I know some of these alerts and issues, were risen to you, and you had to work on, okay, how do we respond to this, and how do we put these into action to make sure they don't get bigger?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of our setup up front was to make sure that we had direct feedback loops consistently, daily throughout the campaign, to take insights that Chris's team was pulling and understand which ones were actionable and how are we going to act on those. And obviously, website fix crisis was a little different than messaging opportunities and saying, okay, it seems like, there's certain perceptions amongst this community that we're seeing. And, we'd come back together and say, maybe we can put together some messaging or push out new digital ad content that, reinforce certain messages, or change perceptions, or reinforce, for instance, like security of the data we knew was going to be a big challenge, and people having questions around how secure is my data. So as we saw comments around that, questions, concerns trickling, we were able to develop more messaging explaining how secure the process was, the privacy and confidentiality of the data, and really then target that through paid media to those specific communities or audiences where we knew that issue was bubbling up. And I think just one other example is during COVID, a lot of marketers were starting to assess their advertising efforts, especially on national campaigns, right, with large integrated buys on digital and TV and traditional, and trying to be sensitive to the times. Also understanding that the news cycle had drastically shifted come March with everything going on. So we put together some COVID specific messaging that reinforced sort of the importance of census in driving key healthcare decisions and supporting healthcare infrastructure in communities. And also as sort of one thing people could do right now before getting to the door-to-door enumeration period was, trying to get everyone to take it online from their home where they could, and really maximize that self-response rate. So as we were pushing out that new content, we wanted to understand how audiences were reacting to it. Was the message on? There were a lot of uncertainty, right, for us and for all marketers around how people were going to react to some of these COVID specific or alluding to COVID messaging. And So we were looking at that and starting to, as we saw certain messages perform well, we were able to sort of promote those out further. We were able to, adjust images, for instance, not showing like tons of big gatherings or close settings and trying to be sensitive to that. But again, looking at social listening to understand how people were reacting to it before we decided to continue to promote it further. So I think the social listening was a critical part of informing more of our outward push strategies around advertising and outreach and social engagement.
Yeah, and the great part about all of that is when you have social listening set up and always on, you can get that data really quickly, of doing a day-by-day report to see what's happening compared to kind of longer term research that goes really, really well in complementing social listening that we'll talk about later. But in the case of census, you don't have months to get that research and be able to adjust.
Yeah. Great. So I'm seeing definitely some questions in on census, which is terrific. We'll plan on, in the interest of getting through some of the other use cases and case studies, we'll plan to tackle some of those at the end if that works. So next one, another healthcare trade association we support. They represent a lot of manufacturers and distributors of healthcare drugs and products. So it's critical that they are continuously aware of public perception around various drugs and products, and specifically when there was significant coverage of loperamide overdoses in 2017, 2018, they needed to understand how this was being discussed by the public, as well as elected officials and FDA, to really inform their communications approach and even inform FDA regulations. So Chris, why don't you drill into this one a little bit?
Yeah, and this was an emerging issue that there really wasn't a lot of information on before this news coverage around the overdoses, because it was a newer trend, and loperamide, when it's taken in extremely high quantities, can act as an opioid, but is also very harmful to your heart. So in response to that news coverage, we answered the question of how far is this issue spreading? How much is it taking? How much is the public taking attention to it? But also, is the FDA paying attention to it? Are elected officials? Are other media outlets? Because that determines what the response is. Because I think a lot of organizations struggle with the question of how do we not over respond to things? How do we not make everything a huge deal and stretch ourselves far too thin by responding and creating campaigns for things that don't need it, but also you don't want to under respond. So actually, before we go to the next slide, this screenshot here is one of the tools we use to track how far links have spread online on social media. It's called CrowdTangle. The Chrome extension is free for everyone to use. So that's a very tangible tip that I encourage everyone to come out of this webinar with, is go download the CrowdTangle Chrome extension, and it'll talk about how to use it, but you'll be able to see things like this about where links have been spread online. So now if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about, okay, what did this mean for the organization once we did an analysis of how far the issue was spreading online on social media, and we determined that this was something that had been gaining momentum in early 2018. So we worked with the client to create a communications campaign that educated people about the risks of taking large amounts of loperamide, healthcare providers, and also at-risk individuals, and did that over the course of the year while also tracking using social listening. How was the conversation changing online? And this was a conversation that was happening primarily on Reddit forums, anonymous forums. People were talking pretty in the weeds about taking high doses of loperamide. And what we found was that over the course of 2018 and into 2019, that conversation did decrease and then reach kind of a steady level. But what was even more interesting, and we shared with the FDA, along with more formal research and summarized of the communication campaign, is that when you look at that line in the chart on toward 2019, that's the percentage of those posts where people referenced or acknowledged the risk of taking loperamide at high doses and how it can be bad for your heart. And we were seeing that steadily increase in 2019. So this was data that showed the people talking about this issue were becoming more educated over time, and they were understanding the risks that came with taking loperamide at very high doses. So it was really interesting to be able to track that over time and come back to that same data and see how it had changed on a month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter basis. And in the end, if you go to a drugstore, you'll find that you can still buy loperamide over the counter. There were positive changes that were introduced to put into blister packs, but not as harsh as some of the changes that were initially being discussed.
I think this is a great example, Chris, too, of the importance of combining the quantitative and qualitative data here. And when you look at these two trend lines, because if we had just been looking at quantitative, we would have seen, the volume of discussion of loperamide going down pretty drastically, especially when you look at March 8 of 18. But we wouldn't have seen sort of the more nuanced, important finding about the risks associated with abuse being mentioned more and more. And I think a lot of those insights were really helpful in informing the client around sort of how to message and what they could do. So oftentimes it's some of the sort of sub trend lines that we see that are really focused on analyzing the various conversations and finding sort of meaning within those and important trends below the sort of macro level. Are conversations on platform going down or increasing? Are overall conversations going down? So I think we often push for that just because it takes manual analysis, while a lot of these tools are great at aggregating insights and organizing them into good charts. The manual analysis piece is super important, as shown here.
Yeah, I mean, one example of how all that comes together recently is like if you were working for Gorilla Glue in the past month, and for those of you who haven't been up on the news of Instagram and TikTok as much, there was a very viral story a few weeks ago of a woman who put Gorilla Glue in her hair and then wasn't able to get it out, and people were suggesting a bunch of different solutions, and eventually she needed surgery, and it all worked out well. But if you were Gorilla Glue, first you need to know that it's happening, and if you have those alerts that we talked about set up, you would be able to find it very quickly, even on platforms you're not necessarily on TikTok and Instagram. I doubt those are Gorilla Glue's go-tos, but then also understanding the nuance of that conversation, where Gorilla Glue is being mentioned, so that you don't turn something where that isn't an issue or crisis for Gorilla Glue into an issue. You don't have that own goal, and Gorilla Glue did avoid that. But blending the quantitative and the qualitative, I imagine, is a lot of what was happening over at Gorilla Glue HQ over in early February.
Yeah, that's a good example. Great. All right. So I think in the interest of time, in the next 10 minutes or so, let's say 8 minutes, we're going to try to go through use case number 3, and then we'll get to a few questions that have come in. So anticipating industry shifts, our last one. I think whether you're in a highly regulated industry that's requires close attention to policy changes, or one more driven by consumer behaviors and consumer demand, it's likely that the conversation, around your industry is increasingly taking place on social media, at least within certain audience or segments of your audience, and perpetuated by news media. You're missing out if you're not listening in. I think there's important industry changes happening. And again, the more intel you can gather, the more proactive you can use that to really shape your strategy, shape messaging, understand how certain current events like COVID may have an impact on your marketing and what you can do about it. So with that, we'll dive into our first case study for this one is focused on, we're gonna do a poll quick. So we'll stop for a quick second. Wanted to get a gauge on how much your industry has changed over the last 3 years. 5 in the poll means changed significantly. 1 is changed slightly, barely, and 3 is somewhere in the middle. So we'll give folks a minute to fill that out.
Aaron, if you were answering this poll, what would you select for working in social and digital media?
I would probably say 5. Digital marketing and digital marketing is all I've known, although we certainly touch a number of industries through our clients, but I think digital is probably one of the fastest shifting industries. It seems like every day platforms like Facebook are changing their ad formats or their policy regulations around what you can and can't say in ads. And so, it's super important that we're up to speed on those. And a lot of our communications with some of these industry partners in digital help us sort of proactively adapt, but we also, I think, pick up on a lot of insights from social listening too, right, Chris? Like when we're seeing certain things, for instance, Facebook makes a change, we'll see that buzzing online, and often sometimes how high that conversation is buzzing is an indicator of like, oh, this is really something we need to look into. So
Yep. It seems like most people definitely agree with that in the 3, 4, 5 range.
Yep. Interesting. All right, so let's dive into our first case study here. I think super relevant for the times. A small pharmaceutical company that we work for in the neurological space took a pretty proactive approach to understanding the impact of COVID on their revenue early in 2020. They knew the ways in which they engaged patients and caregivers to connect with their doctors was going to need a shift. As a lot of people were hesitant to do in-person doctor visits. And so they looked to social listening to understand, sort of how telehealth was being viewed, the perks, the challenges, the barriers, the perceptions, so they could develop a marketing plan specifically for the COVID age. So Chris, talk a little bit about how we sort of broke down telehealth perceptions and the insights there.
Yeah, so we needed to take a closer look at telehealth. I don't get paid to tell you that, hey, there's a pandemic, people are talking more about telehealth. That's pretty obvious. But we wanted to understand what are the common complaints, how were healthcare providers, patients, caregivers experiencing telehealth, and what were the shifts in language. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We were able to take that more nuanced look, find what was trending, from March through July, see how it compared to beforehand, and really inform that strategy by combining it with additional research. Like I said earlier, social listening compare really well with traditional research. But for example, one of the findings social listening was able to surface was even just how people refer to this idea of digital healthcare. Before March 2020, people were most commonly referring it to as digital care when they were talking about it online. Whereas between March and July 2020, when we were doing this analysis, telehealth itself became the most common word people were using to refer to the practice. So even simple things like that are a really interesting and impactful way social listening is able to provide insights that can inform a strategy when you're dealing with these external events like COVID, or like adjusting back to normal after COVID. That'll be another big shift.
Great. So this next one, less COVID specific, but still, I think CBD has been kind of on the rise, an increasing topic amongst consumers over the last really several years. And one of our clients is a leader in the cannabinoid prescription medicine space. And they, as they were seeing a lot of this conversation continue to rise around CBD, especially online, they really wanted to understand sort of what messaging was out there, what consumers' sort of attitudes towards it were, perceptions, maybe misperceptions in some instances, to really inform sort of their messaging strategy. So I'll let Chris talk about this one too.
Yeah, and so this was, again, we need to take a closer, more nuanced look, but more from the lens of how does the client and this organization fit into the new larger conversation and public understanding of CBD. And if you're in a space where you're not quite sure why your social content isn't performing as well, or overall communication strategy isn't performing as well, it might be time to reassess how does this organization fit into the larger landscape of things. And that's what really needed to be done in this case. And by taking a closer look at that, and then using that to create new social media content, new messaging, new graphics, a better understanding of the audience. Engagement rate on Twitter, for example, went from 1.6% to 3.2%, which was fantastic for them and allowed both grew engagement with the audience, which was one of the goals, but also just makes that social media budget go so much further, and makes it more impactful. And the next slide shows some of the examples of what was brought up in some of the audiences we looked into for that landscape analysis of, looking at experts and influencers, but also hospitals and medical staff and patients and their caregivers, and seeing what content that other people were putting out worked well in engaging those different audiences, and how could we fit into that conversation.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example of one of the maybe like less sexy use cases, but one of the most important for us is really using social listening to inform messaging strategy. I think we often say the bait has to taste good to the fish, not the fisherman. And the thought there is that you need to be speaking in the terms, the language that your audience is speaking at. And that can sometimes be tough, right? For associations that have certain way of talking about themselves, their work, their services, but social listening can be a great way to take sort of a data-driven approach and say, these are sort of the common terms, phrases that people are using. And so how do we integrate that in with our messaging strategy smartly in a way that's going to connect with them? And I think this client did a good job of doing that through the social listening insights that we were able to provide. Great. So that wraps up the sort of quote unquote presentation. But we've got a good 10 minutes or so to talk through some Q&A. Feel free to put any questions in now. And I think maybe we can go through and start answering some of these that are in the chat already. The first one, Chris, I'll ask you that came in is, what are your favorite social listening tools? And do you find certain combos are best for your certain listening goals?
Yep, that's a really good question. And as we alluded to earlier, this is done through specialized tools. What's really great about our situation when we work with a lot of clients is they don't need to understand the tools. We bring our own tools on board. And so we're kind of the ones in the weeds. I think that can be a barrier for a lot of people and organizations before starting this. In terms of specific tools, I am familiar with a lot of them today. For example, I'll be in Synthesio, Meltwater, CrowdTangle, Sprinklr for a variety of different projects. My favorite is, I think CrowdTangle is really good for identifying specific pieces of content. Their full dashboards, in addition to the Chrome extension I shared earlier. I really like Sprinklr's customization, but it's not great for when you're doing quick searches, which is why I really like Synthesio for some of those quick searches. So I don't know if I have a favorite per se. And those are kind of the different combinations where it's honestly, they all do the same things pretty similarly, but they're geared a little bit toward kind of how deep do you want to go and how much time are you looking at one specific topic versus a little bit of time at a lot of different topics.
Great. Let's see, one question that I just want to flag, as this got sent actually earlier ahead of time, but I think it's a good one, is our PR team is already doing media monitoring, because I bet this is the case for quite a few folks probably on the line. Would this be redundant with their work, or what would social listening add that's sort of above what the PR team is currently capturing?
Yeah, so that's a really good conversation. And the short answer is it's not redundant. We actually work very closely with the PR team here at Rheingold and different PR teams with the clients. And what I think it does is adds a new layer to media monitoring that a lot of organizations do. And they work hand in hand very well together, because if you understand what's going on in traditional media and you understand what's going on in social media, you can bring that together to understand more of a truer communications landscape of what's out there. So for example, some of the tools are one and the same. Meltwater does traditional and social media monitoring. But I think just as in 20, 30 years ago, you would say traditional media monitoring is something that we need to do just to keep up with what's happening with our brand. I think that's where social listening is coming in today, and working with traditional media monitoring.
Yeah, and I think one thing we often look at is, definitely with many of our clients, is the impact of PR efforts and news media on the social conversation, because we know the media is a big driver oftentimes. And almost every media outlet is using social media sort of live in real time, right? They're publishing content 5, 6, sometimes 20 times an hour. So understanding where our clients are showing up in the news, and then how that is amplified through social media and to what extent and by whom, is definitely a big part of a lot of our work too.
Yep. So we have a question here about how Census dealt with population mobilization during the pandemic, which I don't think we'll get into the behind the scenes of it with the data collection, because there are career data scientists who worked on that. But Aaron, from a communication standpoint, I know you touched on this a little bit, but what were the most important things from a communication standpoint in the response to that? Like, for most important thing or two that you would say in an effective response to population mobilization?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I mean, we had a constant pulse on response rates sort of by geography and how well those matched up to sort of what we had predicted. And a lot of that modeling up front informed, media investments really across the country. But there was also, I think it was equally around sort of messaging. And we knew that a big segment of the population was not necessarily living in their sort of primary residence. And so we had to be clear from a messaging standpoint around filling out the form of your residence on April 1st. Sort of where you live on April 1st is where you should fill out your form, and try to sort of continue to reinforce that. But we also, were able to take data, some of the population data, to inform very specific sort of local outreach. So for instance, like New York City had been hit pretty hard, especially, I think it was late spring or so. And we were seeing response rate was not quite as high as we had anticipated. And so we were looking at what are ways in which we can engage a lot of local partners, local influencers that have sort of deep penetration within the New York community, especially online, where it didn't require a physical presence, right? Audiences were tapped into these partners, these influencers online, and really push out key messaging around the importance of the census and taking the census. And there were, I think many other instances where we dialed into very specific communities and areas across the country through partner outreach, through influencers in some cases, and through targeted media with sort of specific messaging that reflected their current environment. And then obviously through digital, we're able to sort of monitor the impact of that, the performance of that messaging and content, and continue to adjust that throughout the length of the campaign as we saw response data come in.
Yeah, that's great. And I know we only have a few minutes left. We do have one more good question from Andy that will, I think, be our last question. Is, do you think that social listening is a good investment or essential for every organization? And then what tool gives you the best bang for your buck if you have more limited needs? I think, yes, it's a good investment for every organization. I think the level of investment looks differently for each organization. A good investment might only look like a monthly report, quarterly report for an organization. If you have more limited needs, your use cases aren't quite as extensive. But a lot of organizations, I think, do find value in much more sophisticated, deeper needs. I think of all the clients we've brought on in the past 2 years, almost all of them have expanded how much social listening they're doing rather than contracting, because they do find it so valuable. And I think what makes it valuable is it can, what you're focusing on, what you're looking at, can so easily be changed depending on your goals, your time of year, things like that. And in terms of best bang for your buck, again, it depends on what you're looking for. I think Synthesio is a good tool for that, but also the free CrowdTangle Chrome extension is a good place to just start and get your feet wet. But again, that's a more longer answer that I would be happy to follow up with you online, or anyone who's talking about specific tools, looking at them, evaluating. That's something I've had a lot of experience in. Like I've said, I've had first-person experience with a lot of these, so would be happy to follow up with more specifics after the webinar.
Great. Well, I think we're at the end of the hour. Really appreciate all of the questions and folks' time. As we mentioned, we will be sharing this out. So for people who missed it, or if you know someone who you think would benefit from this or would want to see it, we will be sending this out via email after the fact. And of course, always welcome sort of another conversation. If you think social listening is a good opportunity for you, or you aren't quite sure where to start and just want to talk things through, we'd love to connect with you and definitely find a way to work together or find an opportunity that makes sense. So contact information is there for me, but if you find a way to get a hold of someone else at Rheingold, that's great too. So thanks so much again. Hope you enjoyed today, and have a good rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.